Welcome to the Startup Field Guide, where we learn from successful founders of unicorn startups how their companies truly found product market fit. I'm your host, Sandhya Hegde, and today we'll be diving into the story of Hex. So launched in 2019, Hex is a modern collaborative platform for data teams. Hex has over 500 paying customers, primarily data scientists and analytics engineers who really love this product. They can use SQL, Python, R, or even just drag and drop some templates. They can do everything from building simple dashboards to complex applications on top of their data that anyone else can interact with and build on. So love from this user community is so strong that despite Hex not technically being a unicorn yet, I just had to get Barry McCardel on this podcast to ask him everything about how his team has built Hex. Barry, welcome to Field Guide.
Welcome. I'm honored to be a pre-unicorn exception. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's 2023, not 2021. So
that's right.
The
it's a little more generous these days.
the bar is now you do have 500 paying customers, not what silly VCs like us have valued the company.
Yeah. All right. Cool. I'm glad to be here. So.
All right. So Barry, going all the way back to 2011, you started your career officially as an Excel jockey at PwC. What was that like? And, help us connect the dots from there to you saying, okay, I'm going to start this company called Hex. How did it happen? What was kind of the original insight behind Hex?
So I had no idea what I wanted to do in undergrad. I was at Northwestern. There was a lot of things to explore and try. I actually spent most of my time like producing concerts and speakers. So not super clear through line, but I did get really involved in, I took this class in social network analysis, which was like 2009, 2010. So it was, social networks as a concept and the idea of that being a thing to analyze in network science was really taking off.
Right.
And it was really cool. And I actually wound up spending time in a research lab there called Sonic, where we did a bunch of, and no one really called it data science at the time. That hadn't gotten super in vogue, but basically data science on network data. And so these could be networks like, you think of like a social network like a Facebook, or we studied even things like research collaboration networks and like healthcare networks. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff there. And so I just kind of got my eyes open to this whole world of data stuff. I had always been kind of a nerd and it was really cool. I was like starting to write some stuff in R. I was doing a bunch of stuff in spreadsheets. We had built some of our own software in this lab. I still had no idea what I wanted to do after college, and consulting sounded pretty cool because as far as I understood it, it was like, hey, you get to like go in, learn a bunch about these businesses and dive into data and try to generate some insights. And so I went to a small firm that got bought by PwC, and I wound up being the person. I worked on a lot of like airline projects actually randomly. It was really cool. It went really deep in how airlines work. And there's all sorts of interesting data stuff, whether it was network scheduling and airport planning to Wi-Fi pricing for planes. And I was always the person on my teams that wanted to dive into the data. And, I love building a nice deck, slide deck, but I was always like the Excel guy because I loved it. And I was setting up little access databases, like illicit access databases on PCs that I like had PC towers I purloined and like set up at our client site. And I was going really deep on that, and I was building these whole like data apps basically in Excel with like drop downs and buttons and VBA, and it was really like dark arts of Excel. And I was like shipping releases of these models. I was like, this is version 12.1 of the Wi-Fi pricing model and distributing it on thumb drives. It was very cute kind of looking back.
I mean, Excel is still like the best no-code development tool
it's
ever
great.
created. It is so powerful and amazing.
The first blog post on our site actually it's called Long Live Code, and it's kind of a little meditation on like why Excel is so popular. And I think it actually gets this thing right that we try to get right as well. That I like to say is like a low floor and a high ceiling, which is you can go into Excel and just build like a shopping list. Like you don't have to do anything technical really. But you can also build like these insane data apps that I was building with like, calculations and regressions and all this. It's very accessible. And then like you can just ramp in the same UI. And so fast forwarding a little bit, I had a friend who from college who was working at Palantir, and he was like, hey, I was describing what I did. And he was like, hey, like you're doing admirable work in Excel, but like we're a company that's like all we do, and we build software for this. And I found that really appealing. So I spent about 5 years there. I got to work on and solve all sorts of interesting problems using data and working on like very cutting edge of data at a very interesting time. And sort of big data and data science were becoming very hot and in vogue. And I met a bunch of wonderful people, including both of my co-founders. I left, went to a healthcare startup in New York, and like I was like puzzled that, you know, despite having a pretty modern data stack with like a data warehouse and dbt and a BI tool, that we were still doing all of our work like our data team was still doing a lot of work in like one-off SQL scratch pads and Jupyter notebooks floating around and scripts and a lot of stuff winding back in spreadsheets. I was like, kind of funny to be like back in building data apps in Excel. I was like, whoa, we're still doing this. And so I actually started this journey of Hex as a buyer. I was like shopping for something. I was like, certainly someone has built this thing. Like certainly this exists. I'd been in the Palantir bubble for a long time where, you know, we kind of just built our own stuff and weren't really aware what was on the market. And I couldn't find it. And so I was going around to all these friends on data teams and I was like, hey, what do y'all use to solve this problem? You do. And no one had anything good. And what most people were like, hey, this is a problem for us too. But when you find something, let us know.
Right.
And so it took a while to turn the corner from being like a buyer to a builder. But I got together with Glenn and Caitlin, who were two people I loved working with at Palantir. And we kind of took the leap because we were like, hey, if no one's solving this, like maybe we're the people to do it. And so that was the very end of 2019. So we're about 3 years and 4 months or something like that in, and into that journey now.
Makes sense. And I'm curious, what was when you said, who is solving this problem? Like, how would you articulate the heart of the problem? Because one thing I see is, given how, crowded the analytics ecosystem of vendors is, often when I meet a new founder starting up in the space, I have to tell them, no, first you have to start really small. I'm going to ask you what the big vision is, but you have to start really small and do one thing incredibly well if you have a chance at standing out. Otherwise, no matter how good your product is, there's just so much noise in the ecosystem that it's going to get
it's really tough.
enveloped in it. So what was that like one amazing thing you really wanted Hex to nail when you started?
We had a lot of stuff in mind, and I think you're touching something very important, which is like we had a big vision. We had a lot that we knew we could do, but it was like trying to stay really focused early was hard, but it was worth it. We focused on one thing early on, which was sharing and communicating work. We had this sense that one of the most painful things is like a data scientist who might be doing your work in something like a Jupyter notebook or a Python notebook or scripts was like actually taking that and turning it into something other people could interact with. And there were some things out there. There's some open source projects that were like, hey, like you can wire up a UI and publish a thing, but nothing that we felt was like as easy and intuitive as we felt like should exist. And so the first version of Hex was actually very, very light on the editing front. In fact, the first thing we built was basically the ability to take a Python notebook that you already had, drag and drop it in, do some basic parameterization of it, like adding like input parameters and then publishing it. And it turns out that even just by itself was a quite appealing thing, like that like solved a quantum of value for some early people.
Right.
And we actually had some reluctance, I think, to let our vision and focus blow up too much. We were open even at the time to like, maybe that is the four corners of what we do. Like maybe there is this like sharing layer. I think as we thought about the market, and what we realized though was like that sort of like last mile was probably not big enough to build something to solve the depth of like the vision we wanted, much less like build a venture scale business.
Right.
And actually there's some analogs to other markets where if you look at like the design market, there was a bunch of companies for a while that were sort of like, well, we're going to be like the last mile, like you're going to do your work in Sketch, but then we're like the last mile thing that you use to share and communicate your mockups. And those were like real companies, like Abstract, Wake, I think was one. There were others. Yeah, well, InVision, yeah. I mean, and like their lunches, breakfasts, and dinners all got eaten by Figma, which was like the place where people wanted to spend their time. And so we felt like that last mile was a little precarious, even though we did have some conviction that might be the place to start. And so it all sounds very rational linear right now. There was a lot of angst for a few months of like, where do we start? And it's like, I think you do have to like pick a beachhead thing that you're like, oh, we're going to be good at this, and then provide a quantum of value and get into an iteration loop with customers. I think that's actually the most important thing early on is getting, we call it commitment engineering loops.
Right.
Getting into this give-get cycle with early users and customers is like the thing early on, I've come to believe.
Got it. Could you share some numbers around it? So things I'm curious about is, one, like how long after you started the company did you have something in the hands of a end user trying it on their own? Just the kind of sharing collaboration functionality?
We started like full-time in December 2019. And then I remember we had this trip to New York about 3 months later. So it was like the end of February or something. And we built like a first prototype. We'd gone just like heads down and built this thing out. And I remember this moment. It was so surreal. We went and visited one of our early, design partner customers, just friends that I had known on a data team at a company in New York, who we had convinced to try this thing out. And they were like, we went to sit down in this conference room with them for them to get their feedback on like the prototype. And they were like, yeah, it worked. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, yeah, it worked too. They showed me, they demoed what they were doing. They had feedback requests. And I was like, what, it worked? Like we tried to hide our like surprise because we had given it, we were like, and that was a fun moment. I think we were like, I remember getting in the elevator and walking back out onto Spring Street I kind of looked at Caitlin and Glenn and I looked at each other. We were like, do we have users? Like, what? So that was kind of a funny moment.
That's
and
great.
So that was
and
like 3 or 4 months.
To your point,
yeah.
like, getting that 3 months in is super valuable, right? Because it just accelerates all the other features, ideas you want to work on for the rest of the year.
I mentioned this before. I can expand on it a little bit, but there's this concept called commitment engineering that it's not something I invented. Some really smart people I used to work with said this all the time, but I'm becoming an evangelist for it now, which is, I think really early on, founders will often try to be like, okay, I've got my startup idea and I've got my product prototype and I'm going to go try to sell it now. And I'm going to convince people of this thing. I think early on, the most important thing to do is like be the person who really understands the problem and try to find the people who feel that problem really acutely. And then you get into what I call this commitment engineering loop, which is the first thing you're asking for is not like, will you buy my software? With these first people, the first thing you're asking for is like, hey, it sounds like you have this pain point. Would you take a half hour and do a call and just tell me about it? And if they say yes, then like, great, you've started something. If they say no, you're like, this is clearly not a big enough pain point for them to take a half hour and talk to you. Like that tells you something. It's like early signal, even before you have a single line of code written. And then once you do have some code written, it's like, hey, will you take a half hour and like click around in a prototype with me? And then you're testing that. Like, are they willing to give their time? Are they willing to make a commitment to you that's non-monetary, but they're giving you something because you're giving them something, right? Like it's a give-get loop. And you can kind of ride that all the way through. You can be like, hey, like, great. Well, if I came back with another version of this in 3 weeks that addressed feedback XYZ, would you do a 45-minute session and would you invite your boss or a colleague or would you use this for real for a day? And like, you're just testing the whole way up, all the way up through, will you sign this contract? But that doesn't, you can validate your way up. And I think getting into those loops early and getting those feedback loops and just finding a way to validate, am I on the right track, is so important versus what you do see some founders do. And it's very, common mistake, which is like spend 6 months, like just building in a hole. And then you get out there and you start validating by trying to sell it. And it's like, well, if you got some foundational assumptions wrong, like you don't want to find that out that far in.
Yeah, I think the other thing I want to point out to our listeners, especially about your approaches, you're not validating the idea by asking if someone likes it. You're validating it by asking for more commitment, right?
That's right. Yes.
It's really easy to, have this like really eager founder showing you their baby. It's really easy to be like, yeah, I have that
Looks
problem.
Cool. Looks great.
I could see us using it maybe in a few years. Yeah. Like, right. And
will you actually connect it to your data now? Oh no, we've got a lot going on, not right now.
Yeah.
And, it tells you something, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I love the focus on commitment as the validation, not the words being used instant response to your demo,
You
right?
you have happy ears early, right? You want to know. You're like, hey, I want to hear that this idea and this thing is going to take the world over, right?
Yeah. You have to
That
remember
honesty,
that you are biased and someone else is trying to be nice to you.
Yeah, it's eternal, and I've had so many moments in my career and even at Hex where that old age-old wisdom of like, you're the easiest one to fool comes in. If you can convince yourself of almost anything, and real intellectual honesty, even if it's painful in the moment when you hear that the thing you've just spent a bunch of time on is not it. Like,
right.
It's important. It's hard though. It's really hard.
Yeah. I'm curious, like what was the pattern in, early adopters who leaned in versus those who leaned out? I'm assuming, not everybody is like, yeah, I'm going to try this right now. Was there any underlying pattern that helped you crystallize who is the early adopter customer? Who is that persona? Like, what are we looking for when we, reach out to people?
Totally. So data is a really big space,
right.
and we discovered something. I think it's intuitive enough to say, but it took us some time to to really crystallize it, which was the problem we were solving initially. Like, our early value prop was about this like sharing and communication thing, and there was basically like two classes of people we would talk to. We talked to the people that we'd be like, yeah, like we talk about the pain point we were solving, like sharing and fragmentation and like sending around PDFs and screenshots of reports and all that. And there were people who were like nodding. I would describe the problem and, I'd just be getting head nods. And then there's people who are like, sharing. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really share. And it was like weird. It was like the thing we discovered is like, there's really two classes of people. There's people doing basically analytics, which even if they call themselves data scientists, like, I think analytics is like a big part, is like this big part of the data world, which is basically you're trying to ask and answer questions to influence a decision. And then there was people who were doing what I would broadly characterize as ML engineering, which is like, I'm iterating on a model that is going to run to make a prediction somewhere.
Right.
And like the former has like a lot of problems around sharing and communication because you're like trying to influence a decision. The latter, like, it was not a big part of their workflow, and they were asking us for very different things. And so I think early on we got confused, honestly, because we weren't thinking as clearly enough about this, which is kind of embarrassing because we had so much experience in this space. But and we were jumbling those things up, and we were taking feedback from both and sort of putting them in the same hopper, where like the people in the latter were asking us for basically a completely different set of things.
Right.
And it took us, I think, a while to get comfortable just saying no or like ignoring and putting blinders on. And I think as a founder, again, you have happy ears and you want every discovery call you do to be like a great discovery call.
Right.
And like the person on the other side being like, yeah, I can't wait to use this. And like, I think as a founder, you have to like get really comfortable in the first few minutes. If like if the person on the other side is like, it's not clicking, like just being like, hey, you know what? I want to respect your time. Like, I'll circle back if we go down this path. Like, that's really powerful. I actually had a sales call earlier this week with like a very large company that would be a great prospect for us, like as a logo, where I was literally like in the first 10 minutes, I was asking them a bunch of questions. And then I was like, okay, it sounds like this is not for you. And we wrapped up the call and we all moved on with our days. And like, you got to get comfy with that early on of like having that focus.
Right. Yeah, no, makes sense. I think one thing I really took away from what you were saying was that even though the title might be data scientist for these two different people, they might have the same exact title outside looking in. You're like, yes, this is the same customer persona, yada, yada, right?
Well, data science, it's such a funny thing, just as an aside, like, I regret, I there's a lot of regret around like data science even becoming a title, because it's just like, there's a lot of jokes around this, right? That's like, you're data scientists or data analysts who like do the same thing in Python. It's a little reductive, because I think a good data scientist is bringing a level of statistical rigor and insight into what they're doing. They're typically thinking about things like experimentations, sample sizes, forecasting. There is deeper techniques to bring to bear, and certainly most data scientists are doing that. But I think a lot of those, if you kind of survey data scientists, I think the majority certainly are effectively doing analytics. They're asking and answering questions to influence a decision, versus like, I am training a deep learning model that we're going to deploy behind an API endpoint to serve online predictions. Like, that is a very different discipline, even if like theoretically, they're both like querying data and charts are generated along the way.
Makes sense. So going back to Feb 2020, which also momentous month in the history of the world. But
I didn't realize it would be my last trip to New York for a while, or trip anywhere for a while.
but we'll get to that point later. But so walk me through like the rest of 2020. Like at what point did you kind of just say, okay, you know what? We no longer want people to upload notebooks into Hex. We want all the work to happen in Hex. Like, what was that transition, and how many like end users or customers did you have at the time when you started going kind of deeper into the product roadmap?
Well, just a handful. We were reluctant to blow up our scope too much. I think we were like, I think the abundance of ideas we had actually made us a little paranoid. We were like, there's all this stuff we could do. Because you gotta remember, we'd spent like 5 years together at Palantir building, Palantir has built a huge number of different analytics and data surface areas. So we had seen plenty of data points in terms of all the things one could build. And Hex is not a reflection of any one thing at Palantir, but we had a sense of there's a ton that one could do in this space, and focus being important. In fact, that was a lesson I took away from Palantir, is focus is really important, because there were moments where we did or didn't have that. It was, though, very clear to us when we were talking to these early customers. I remember one conversation in particular where all the feedback was on the editing experience. And we were like, well, would you ever just want to like keep editing this in Jupyter? And the guy was like, no, Jupyter sucks. And I was like, well, that's a little strong. Like, tell me more about that though. Because I was a big Jupyter fan for a long time, and I still am. But he got into it, and he was telling us about his whole workflow. And it was like, oh, okay, like I can see why your takeaway from this workflow is that you were looking for something to actually, like, we had created a good experience for him on the last mile. And he was like, he wanted that goodness like permeating further forward. And so that was just like all the feedback we were getting basically was around that. And I had been a user of notebooks for a long time. I'm probably 10 years into using some form of a IPython notebook now. And I think we had always had this feeling of not wanting to build a notebook company, because I had always felt like notebooks weren't a market. And I still don't. I think notebooks aren't a job to be done or a problem to be solved. They're like a format. It'd be like saying I'm building a text editor. You're like, well, what kind of text are you editing? And so if we were going to take this on, I think we wanted to make sure we were being like focused and disciplined on like what we thought this could look like. And we had a really clear picture of what we thought like a actually much better end-to-end workflow for these things could be. It's just a lot to bite off. And I think it took us a little bit to like get confident of like, yeah, okay, there was almost a moment I remember that this feeling of like, we didn't choose this life, this chose us. It was like the pull is there. We have all this knowledge. We have all this experience. All right, I guess we have to do this. And, I'm obviously glad we did, because I think we've been able to bring a lot to it. But it took a lot of pull from users to almost like drag us there. Like we weren't pushing it. And I think that's what made it feel authentic and ultimately built our confidence.
And what did the customer profile look like in your first year? So was it mostly smaller teams, smaller startups? Did you have kind of larger companies already?
All smaller companies. I think in data, it's just, maybe this is intuitive to everyone, but I think it's perhaps a little underappreciated. In data, like being able to actually connect to your customers' data is just like everything. It's like the sun and the stars and the moon. You can get like a little ways, like being like, all right, just upload a CSV, but you are not going to, you're not going to get to any meaningful revenue on the back of CSV uploads. And so we had known that, like, in fact, we had worked in the most paranoid data environments in the world at Palantir, where getting access to customer data was often a matter of like years of trust building. That was very important to us early on. So we just focused on early startups and tech companies that, typically are a little more permissive in terms of that, where there wasn't a lot of Baroque processes. Now it's very different. We are working with large companies. We have a lot of public companies as customers. We have, built out a lot, whether it's SOC 2 to private VPC deployments to SSH data connection. We built a ton around that. But early on, if we had to go and build all of that stuff just to iterate on product market fit, we would not be where we are.
Makes sense. So 2 follow-up questions there. One, you started a company kind of post the warehouse becoming a kind of strategy, right? Especially companies like Snowflake, but like kind of people trying to standardize on this idea of like, okay, we want all our data unified in a warehouse so that we can figure out what to do with it later. How was that a tailwind for Hex? Like, how did you experience that?
It's like the tailwind for Hex.
And two, I would say, given that that is something small startups don't necessarily do, right? Like, a 10-person startup might not have done the warehouse unified data thing yet. So I'm curious about that tension because you're talking to small companies, but you want to leverage this warehouse tailwind. How did that play out?
Yeah, well, first, I think that is like the tailwind for X. Like, I think this modern data stack where you're bringing your data together, you have Snowflakes of the world, the BigQueries of the world. You've got dbt and Fivetran, and when I started my career in data, let's say 10 years ago or longer, the idea of like going to a single place to go find a bunch of clean, ready for analysis data about your business was like preposterous. Like when I was in consulting in airlines, like the way I got data delivered to me was like, you literally go down the hall on the 13th floor to find Tom, who's got access to the MySQL thing, who can pull you an extract once a week in a CSV that then I can go to. It was like, and then at Palantir, we had all these customers who, they've got 18 different data lakes and a lot of different databases, and this was really before the columnar data warehouses were a thing. And fast forward to now, and like it's not a solved problem for every company in the world, but even really big Fortune 500 businesses, we talk to them, they're like, yep, we got cloud data warehouses, we're using starting to adopt modern ETL tools, yep, we got a warehouse with these analytic tables.
Right.
And now the question is like, well, what do we do with that?
Right.
And how do we empower people, and how do we make that easier? Like, I think the last few years the story's been around data infrastructure. I think there's now all these new expressions of what you can go and do with that. Really small startups, they don't typically have that. And a lot of them, when they're using Hex, are maybe using like Python to connect to an API or something to pull some data in. But our sweet spot, even early on, was sort of what I would call like scaling tech companies. You'd have companies, 50 to 500 people was what we used to talk about. And those sizes of companies are standing up data warehouses. And again, like 10 years ago, the idea of a 50-person company having an enterprise data warehouse was like, what are you racking and stacking like servers for Teradata? Like, now it's like, you just go and sign up for Snowflake and like set up a Fivetran connector and all the data is there. And it's like, it is just like orders of magnitude simpler for people to get their data in that type of pattern.
So maybe pivoting a little bit to kind of, team building. So you pretty much like launched your MVP same time the world was going into lockdown.
Also raised a seed round when everyone thought the economy was going away, which was a very weird time.
Very, very short window though.
I chose the short window of panic to raise our first round. So that was an interesting experience.
What's been your approach to building a team? You have hired some people that, I love very much. So I'm curious, like, how have you thought about building a team and especially like building a good connected culture while, a lot of us have been remote and distributed?
Yeah, it was interesting. There's a funny story. Our first employee started, it was like March 6th or 9th or something like that of 2020. And we had just moved into this new office in San Francisco. We were so excited. We had like this office space that had 2 rooms. Like that was really nice, And he came and I had set up like a monitor and like got his laptop. It was like our first employee's here, yay! And we had one day in the office with him, and then we were like, oh, we should probably work from home. So like all of the early hiring, I think up through 15 people or more actually was done fully remote. And distributed. We wound up with people all over the US. I think we've done a pretty good job on this. I don't think I have a silver bullet. I think in terms of a connected culture, I think we try to get together a bunch. And I think in general, especially when you're remote and you worry about like permeating best practices, when I'm at my best, I think I try to be really mindful and make sure I'm taking my time to highlight examples of what good looks like. I talked to some founders and they're like, oh, I've got all these people and it's like tough to feel like we're all in the same culture. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to write like a values manifesto and I'm going to send it around. And like, it's like, okay, like we have that too. We have our handbook. It's public on the website. You can go check it out. We have values in there. But I find that the most effective single thing you can do to calibrate a culture, and it's probably true in person or remote, but especially as you get bigger, where you do have people just all over the place, is regular shout outs for what good looks like from you, the founder. And so just earlier this week, we had a part of our product that was sort of like very long neglected. It was never the most urgent thing, but it was always like kind of a source of shame. It's like, this is not good. And one of our designers went and just redesigned the whole thing. And she took the time to do it, and it's beautiful now. And I shouted that out in the company, in the Slack, in our product channel, because I felt like I wanted other people to see that. I both wanted to give her props because it was sweet, but the real motivation was like, hey, I want other people to see that and be like, that's what good looks like here. That's what I should aspire to. And when I'm at my best, I try to do that a lot. I find that to be like the one most important thing, probably.
Yeah, and it all comes back to storytelling and the stories that motivate us and make sense out of what's happening in the world. I've always told, every founder I've worked with that, like, you'll be surprised how powerful a tool storytelling is for building your business and how much difference that makes versus, all the other things you're going to focus on, because it gives you leverage across every single activity you're going to do.
I think that's really insightful. I think that's really, really insightful. I think storytelling is probably most of the job as a founder. If you really think about what you're doing, you're telling candidate stories, telling customer stories, you're telling investor stories, you're telling your team stories. And that sounds like stories like, fantasy stories. Like, you're telling a narrative of the way you see the world. And, different founders will do different amounts of extrapolation into the future on that. But I think that's very insightful. I think that's right.
So speaking of the future, I would suspect that like once you have built this Hex product, you have a data team that has built a bunch of applications, dashboards, they have done all their work on, in SQL or Python, but now they have built a surface area that's accessible to the rest of the company. How are you seeing Hex's user profile change? You have tens of thousands of users, 500 paying customers. What does the future of Hex look like in terms of the people who are a part of this community that, you are betting on 2-3 years from now versus today?
Yeah, I think the problem that we hear really consistently from customers is around fragmentation. I think people wind up doing work in a bunch of different places. Most of these tools aren't built for collaboration. Most of them have no sense of organization or governance or permanence. So, you do some really great work and then you leave the company. It's like, where did that go? And communication's really broken. A lot of insights live in charts and screenshots of charts and PDFs of decks in an email somewhere from 3 years ago. Like, it's just not great. That is a big part of, I think, the story and the pain that we hear from our customers. And so when you think about that cuts across a lot of different workflows and users and use cases. And so we were talking earlier about focus in the early days. I think it's actually just equally important now, and something I try to put a lot of energy into, of like, there's a ton of directions that people pull Hex in. We have people build all sorts of crazy stuff. Like on Twitter, I saw someone the other day built this like 20 questions app using OpenAI, like GPT-3 API. It's like, you can build all sorts of stuff. And that means that's awesome because it's a flexible tool. People will take it in all these cool directions. There's a pleasure and a joy and a pride that we take in building powerful tools for creative people. I think it's really fun to build those types of products. On the other hand, it's very stressful because you wind up getting a lot of different types of feedback. We were talking earlier about different personas giving you different feedback. There was a problem today. And I think I've tried to get really good at both like making decisions on what we're going to focus on, but then making sure even like what our salespeople know that, like when they get a request from a customer, I would rather them telling them, nope, we are not focused on that, than like, oh yeah, that's on the roadmap, or whatever people wind up saying.
Right.
So for us, the one of the biggest changes in the profile is like people just use it. The type of people who use it is different over time, which is early on in a customer, we'll see the main people using Hex are the people with data in their job title.
Right.
Data scientist, data analyst, analytics engineer, people in the data team. And then they share it out with other people, and you wind up with this effect of like, you have PMs and engineers, and so one case even I talked to someone who's just on the sales team who uses Hex. They know how to write some SQL, and it's actually like the best place to write SQL. That is really gratifying, I think, to see that sort of spread, and it's very cool. Again, it does cause tension sometimes because you have like the requests you're going to get from like an ML engineer are different than the requests you're going to get from a product manager when they're using the product.
Right.
And knowing who to focus on and how to have a UX and a UI that is going to do a good job being that low floor, high ceiling is a very interesting challenge. I think it's a worthy challenge. It's something we enjoy. But I think if you're building in the data and analytics space, especially if you're building tools that have a lot of flexibility, you're going to have that same challenge. And so founders, I think, really have to be disciplined on saying no. And as their team grows, also making sure that like you're communicating that down through the org, because you want everyone on the same page.
I think this is a great example of how I think, particularly for enterprise software, since you have a more complex customer journey, product market fit is not actually like a milestone. It's, you hit it and then you have to keep it and grow it and make it stronger. And suddenly you have to think about like, okay, different parts of your product for different parts of the market. Like, especially if you're doing collaboration software, I think, it's really like a constant work in progress, not, a milestone you hit.
And in a space moving as fast as data too, like the thing that would have had PMF 5 years ago might not today.
Right.
And like, you gotta, as a founder, I think one of the hard parts is like, you're always trying to like, build the next feature, close the next deal, but you also have to like hold in your head, like a sense of like how things are changing. And with everything happening with AI right now, there's like, even like, I think a new strata on that, which is there, like, I think just a bunch of like foundational assumptions are changing as well.
I'll take that as an invitation to put you on the spot about your AI strategy.
Sure. Yes.
I was trying to hold back, but I think it, obviously fascinating. The most fascinating thing is actually for me the code generation, right? Like text to Python, text to SQL, like of all the things that this thing does well, that seems to be one, particular and unexpected strength. And so I'm curious, like, how you're thinking about the future of Hex in that context.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We, our number one mission is empowering people working with data, and we think that people are going to stay involved in that for a while. We believe that data work is fundamentally creative. I know you don't think of like a data scientist when you think of a creative. You might think of a artist or musician or whatever, but if you think about a lot of data work, it is creative. You're forming hypotheses, you're exploring ideas, you're telling stories, you're building beautiful charts, you're taking some risks. It is a creative and stimulating endeavor. It's also like can be so frustrating and tedious because you're like tracing down a missing parenthesis or fixing your Python dependencies. And I see AI in every domain as a chance to allow humans to focus on that creative, engaging, stimulating work that humans are uniquely capable of, and to partner with AI to sort of abstract away a lot of that tedium. And if you look at the way a software engineer uses like GitHub Copilot, we a lot of engineers on our team use Copilot. When you talk to them about it, it's like, yeah, well, I don't have to worry about a lot of the like BS that I had to before. Right. Like it takes care of boilerplate for me. Like I am thinking at a higher level more consistently, and that lets me move faster and explore things in more depth. We see that exact same thing with people using our AI features, which we call Hex Magic, a set of magic tools. It lets you generate, edit, debug, and explain code right in your workflow. It's built directly into the cells where you're writing SQL or you're writing Python. Very importantly, we are not building some black box thing where like a business stakeholder is going to like roll up and be like, tell me an answer. And it's going to spit out like a perfectly formatted chart with explanations and like built out data pipelines behind it. Like, I think in data, especially, it can be dangerous to do that because there is like correct answers to things. Like and there's already enough problems with organizations getting to different answers for the same question. I think you want to make sure that if you're building something AI assisted, that you're, at least right now, you're keeping humans in the loop.
Yeah.
So we actually have a rule as we're building these features of like, we don't run the code. Like if you generate something in Hex, you hit the run button. And that's because like we really see it as like, hey, this is here to help you iterate. And I think it's really interesting too to see the way people wind up using it. It's similar to other types of generative AI workflows. Like if you've used ChatGPT or if you spend any time with the image generator, things like Midjourney or Stable Diffusion, you wind up working in this really iterative way.
Right.
Like it's not like a 0-shot, 1-shot thing where you go like, what's the answer to this question? The users who really find success with this in our product and the way I wind up using it when I use it is I'll ask a basic thing. I'll be like, number of customers broken down by tier. Okay, add revenue.
Right.
Add this. Like, build a chart. Like, factor this code out. Like, it's an iterative process where you're partnering with it. That I think is what, like, getting that UX right is really one of the most important things, I think, to building an AI-driven product. It is not hard. I promise you, it's not hard to build a quick demo. And there's like a million of them now in the data space of like, ask a question and it will generate a SQL query. Like that, I don't know, like half the YC batch was that, I think. But it's like much harder to like, okay, what's the right UX for this? And then also like have the data to know how to prompt these things accurately. Like being able to take in context, like the rest of the project or the database schemas or past queries or past code or past completions people have accepted or rejected. Like getting all that right is also like the real hard part, so that the models themselves are becoming commodities. It's how you package that up and build the right prompts and the right UX to allow humans to partner with this that I think will matter in this next generation of productivity tools.
Yeah. And, how do we create a future that's not an even worse governance nightmare than we already have today, right? Like this could easily become like our version of news misinformation, where there's like, here's the image in my mind, right? There is a head of sales and a head of marketing, both pointing to their ChatGPT chart saying, no.
Well, they prompted it differently. The salesperson saying, why is the bottleneck top of funnel? And the marketing person is, why is the bottleneck sales execution? You could answer, you could probably tell a story for either of those things. So that's why I think the data
sales team has not converted all my amazing
tell me why the VP of sales. Yeah, that's right.
Awesome.
That is why I'm a believer in the data team and the continued value of data teams. Even if you can have a bot that can generate some valid SQL, that is like not that assumes that like data teams are SQL monkeys, and like I just don't think that's what they're there for. And I think that will actually become clearer in the same way that like developers, they're not there just to like bang out typescripts. They're there to like be creative and think and architect something. So it's a very similar thing I think we're going to see in every domain.
Makes sense. Maybe, wrap up on a quick last question. What would be your advice to, 2023 new founders thinking about building data startups? What would be your advice? Not allowed to say that. You can't just say don't.
Yeah. I think that we are at a point in data where you should assume there's exactly zero pure greenfield. Like I've talked to some founders and they're like, hunting around for like the patch of grass that no one's ever stood on. And it's funny because even successful companies like, the youngins these days don't even realize like, there was like generations of data warehouse companies before Snowflake. Like there was generations of ETL companies before like dbt and Fivetran. Like there are some old, like, does anyone remember Ab Initio? Like, so people have done like there's no new ideas, I think. And that's okay. Like that's actually like, I think one thing you learn is that like ideas are cheap, like execution rules the day. And so I would think really carefully about what are the areas where you and your team have a unique license to execute.
Right.
And what are the areas where you have unique insight and passion. And I think data was very hot the last few years. There was a lot of VC dollars. And I'm certainly the beneficiary of that. You could call me a hypocrite for saying this, in fact. But I think just being like, oh, I want to start a startup in data, you got to realize that there's like 80 other people with the same idea that have come before and are going to come after. And you have to really be honest with yourself about where you have unique insight or execution ability. That would be my advice.
Very good advice. And thank you so much for joining our show, Barry.
Thanks for having me.
I enjoyed this
conversation
so much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. This was great. And hope to join maybe sometime soon or down the road.
You've been listening to the Startup Field Guide with Sandhya, an Unusual Ventures podcast. Stay connected with us by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you liked what you heard, please rate our show and help us reach more aspiring founders with lessons on how to find product market fit. Thanks for listening. Until next time.